I named my presentation with the word interaction because many of the things are really not relations. They are accidental moments when Korea and my country came together. The whole history of Czech-Korean relations in fact started in 1871. You might be surprised, but very often the history is not as easy as it looks like. And the infamous United States Navy attack on Kangwa Island was in effect in a strict and very multinational effort. Because there was not less than 40 different nationalities on board of these 5 American boats. And among them were Swedes, Portuguese, Polish, Austrians, Russians, even a couple of Koreans, but also Czechs. We know about 2 Czechs. One of them is William F. Lukes. You will ask why I speak about the Czech with a very typical English name. But what we know, it was very typical for those times that the names were anglicized. The other Czech we know, whose name was August Chlub, has a very difficult Czech name. But we don't know anything else than his age and the fact that he was on the boat. With William F. Lukes we have more. We suspect that his name was Wilhelm Lux, because the village where he was supposedly born has a lot of graves with name Lux. Lux and Lukes, the similarity is here. But this Wilhelm Lux really behaved bravely. He was not a soldier, he was not a mariner, but he came to Kangwa Island with the first attacking group on the fortress, and we see on the lovely, interesting contemporary drawing, this is him fighting. He received something around 20 different wounds, and he had to rehabilitate for quite some time before he was honored with the highest possible American award, Medal of Honor. And he became thus the second Czech who received the Medal of Honor after one man who was fighting in the wars in America. We don't know anything about him. As I say, we have this drawing, we have one very low quality photograph which is not here, and we know that he came to American boats in China. We know the place of his birth, but not a birth certificate, and we know also that he lived in the United States. Absolutely uninteresting life, we know nothing about, and we only know that he died. Wow. This is a very typical thing. That means this is his grave, we see William F. Lukes, Korean campaign, and he died. That's all we know. This was the very first real direct contact between Czechs and Koreans. I'm sorry. Something is weird. The very real first contacts came in 1891, and this is the document of ratification of the first agreement between Austro-Hungary and Korea. There was not many countries which established the diplomatic relations with Korea, as you know, and there were only 2 of them which established the diplomatic relations but never opened their legation. Austria-Hungary was one of them. We know about accidental visits by Austro-Hungarian boats, and I think that Robert Neff could speak very much about it. We have also at least 2 visits by Austro-Hungarian diplomats coming probably from Tokyo or China, but virtually Korean Austro-Hungarian relations were close to none. It was a German embassy which represented Austria-Hungary, and really nothing was much known, except of twice in the history Korea also accredited their envoy to Vienna. It was in 1900 and 1901 or 1902. There is another accidental contact, which is very much literary and art. The very first ever book published in the West, translated from Korean, was the famous tale of Chunhyang. The edition of 1892 was translated into French, and accidentally it was illustrated by famous Czech painter Luděk Marolt. How it happened? Luděk Marolt was then fairly established but still a young painter studying in Paris, and he had to have money, and he was landing various jobs to do. And one day he landed a job to make illustrations for a Korean tale. He had no idea what is it. He made the job, and that was the end. But thanks to this, Czech illustrator became the part of the very first translation of Korean literature in the world. Luděk Malos later on came to Bohemia and became one of the leading artists of the late 19th century, one of the nationalistic symbols of the art of then Bohemia, which was under Austrian yoke. But there were a couple of other interesting Czechs. There were more, of course, and once more Robert knows more about it. The most interesting was the first, Josef Haas, which very soon we will have an article about him by Robert Neff, who was a very interesting personality himself. He came to China as a very young man, and he became the first Austrian/Czech who learned Chinese. His interests were beyond that learning Chinese to speak. He started writing about Chinese, about China, and soon he was claiming up on the ladder of diplomatic service and consul service of Austria-Hungary. He started really as a lowest ranking officer, and he ended his career as a consul general in Shanghai. In fact, he was all his life almost sitting in Shanghai. What we don't know, and it will be part of the Robert's article, is that one day he came to Korea and spent here a couple of months being invited by von Mellendorf. He was running head of the Seoul Customs. He was the man who signed the agreement for printing the first Korean stamps. But what's interesting, he's nowhere mentioned. And we found him by the fact that one of a well-known Czech sinologist wrote an article about his role in creating of Czech and Austrian Chinese studies. And she mentioned one sentence. And it is said that he might be in Korea, but it is not the case. And I brought it to Robert Neff, and we found very soon that it was the case, and he was here. But what he was doing is still a bit mysterious. Another person, Max Taubles, is more a funny guy. I will quote once more, his importance in Korea lies only in one thing. He was born in Prague, traveled to America. From America he became an expert in Japanese art, and one day he landed to Korea. His famous role in Korea is that he is that only and first person who died as a Westerner in Korea in Seoul. This is his dubious honor, as Robert Neff said. That's nothing else. We don't know anything about, except we have still his grave here. Two other persons are more important, but they came late, both of them in 1901. Josef Kořenský was a kind of a most influential person among the Czech children from the whole late 19th century until, let's say, 1940s. He wrote numerous books covering the whole world, geography and travelogues, and he was traveling really all over the world. He was not an explorer. He was a standard traveler, having a good friend who was rich and who can do it and take him with him, and he was writing. He wrote a couple of chapters about Korea, but they were nothing very important. More important is a man named Enrique Stankovras. He's a mysterious person who probably was born as Czech, but nobody knows it, but he wanted to be Czech, and he told he is Czech. He became one of the early photographers of Africa and Latin America, starting already in the 1880s. And when he came to Korea in 1901, he was a very accomplished photographer. And thanks to this, we have 150 photographs of Seoul and General Road in our collections, which were never published until the book. These are the books, these are the typical photos. This is most famous portrait of Enrique Stankovras on the right-hand side, and the beginning of the chapter, which is saying, from Beijing through Korea to Siberia. In fact, he never wrote anything about Korea. That one paragraph he wrote about Korea tells nothing. He was planning to do more, but he didn't do that. He only published a long article 20 years later, but we don't know how much is the article really based on his knowledge or its secondary. It's a rewriting of secondary sources. These are the typical signs or typical examples of his big photographs. Here we see himself standing in one of the smaller buildings in Pyongyang with his guide, who was a Korean. And this is Nam Daejeon on his photograph. And for those who are interested, the most interesting photographs were published in this book, published by Seoul History Museum, and also there was a big exhibition. There was nothing going much later on because of the Japanese occupation. Also, Czechoslovakia only emerged in 1918. But there was an important moment in history. Before Czechoslovakia emerged after the end of World War I, there was a huge army created on the territory of Russia. The army started later on fighting with the Bolshevik forces, and they had to get out. And the only way how to get from Russian territory was by train, getting further and further through Siberia up to Vladivostok. During the fierce fights, the whole army of 60,000 people succeeded to move up to Vladivostok, and they, of course, became in contact with the Koreans. And they were also the first official, if we can say it, contact there. Major General of all the whole army, whose name was Radola Gaida, was probably in contact with various other people, and that's why one day he received Yeonhyun. It was before the Shanghai Korean government in exile was created, and Yeonhyun made an agreement with Radola Gaida on two things. That first, some Koreans started fighting on the Czech side, and as we know from the Czech sources, not less than 16 Koreans were on board on the flag train. I'm not using the term flagship, but flag train, fighting on the Vladivostok area. And also, Radola Gaida, to save Yeonhyun from danger of Japanese, he gave one of his armored trains, and he brought Yeonhyun back to Shanghai. The other thing was that the army had to get rid of a huge armament, and there was an agreement done that the armaments will be left on place. That was a chance for the emerging Korean independence fighters. There is not much real information from Czech sources about it, but we do have plenty of information from Korean sources speaking about the amount of armaments and ammunition being sold for zero price or given free of charge to Korean fighters who were smuggling all the arms up to the Manchuria. And in many Korean information says that without these Czechoslovak arms, there was not the only important big early battle of the Korean independence fighter battle in Cheongsan-li, which was won thanks to Czechoslovak arms. Czechoslovaks were very interested in what's going on in Korea. It was very much also psychological thing. Don't forget that the Czechs were for 300 years subjugated by the Austrians, and they only achieved independence in 1918. That's why the fate of another small nation subjugated to somebody else was of their interest, and they very much followed what the Koreans did. For example, here we see an interesting text which is not very much visible in a daily produced by the army in Siberia, and this is one of the early articles about March 1st movement. It says, problems in Korea, and now it describes what's going on in Korea on the March 1st and March 2nd. It was published on March 5th or 6th. And also, there is the only document from Czech sources confirming that the Czechoslovak soldiers were giving the arms to Korean independence fighters. It's a report by our de facto consul in Harbin saying that Japanese already for the second time informed him that they should stop giving the arms to Koreans, otherwise there will be a big problems. And also, as I said, there was the interest, and many of the soldiers had early cameras. And there is a very good collection of Korean-related photographs from Vladivostok area made by Czechoslovak soldiers. I think this is a wonderful portrait by a Korean from Vladivostok made by a Czech. And also, they were very much, Czechs are very curious people. That means they wanted to get, that is, we see a lovely photo of Korean wedding, and here, if you look, we have the one Czechoslovak soldier, the other Czechoslovak posing to have a souvenir to bring back home that they have taken part in it. Many such photographs are still lying in our archive. When the soldiers came back, they brought back their interest in the Far East. And it's interesting that there was many books in the 1920s and 60s devoted to Siberia, China, and of course Korea as well. Already in 1932, one of 2 volumes of Korean fairy tales were translated into Czech, translated from Russian originals. And there is even more curious thing going from 1925. I know you will tell the cover is not Korean, of course. This is a very tiny book which I discovered was not known until I found it in a second-hand bookshop. It is a very tiny booklet consisting of 2 different dramas. The first drama is set in Siam or Thailand, and it has the cover. The second is set in Korea. And what's visible, the person who wrote the drama had a very good idea about Korean history. It's a story about the love between a humble woman and a nobleman somewhere in the late Joseon, with all the interesting, typical small things then you know that somebody knew about Korea. And the most interesting thing, I had a good luck that part of the book when I bought it was a leaflet to the play, where it says, please note one important thing. At the end of the story, the both Korean lovers kiss each other. We know that this is not exactly the knowledge of Korea, but the author knows it and says, please note that kissing in Korea is not as it is in Europe, but I had to change this for the Czech audience, because the Czech audience will not understand the end of the play. Meaning, once more, the person who was a psychologist, we don't know when he died, we don't know anything more about him, had a very good knowledge of Korea. And he probably got it because he was a part of the Czechoslovak soldiers in Vladivostok area. And the same thing is, early Czech traveler who was an expert in Japanology and translator from Japanese literature came also to Korea, and she wrote a lovely young adult novel for children, which is set in occupied Korea, where the 2 young boy and a girl are fighting for the independence. It is interesting to see that the lady who really loved Japan, she was even in Czechoslovakia wearing kimono, and she really loved Japan, wrote a book which was very, very pro-Korean and very negatively looking on Japan. That's very interesting. But unfortunately, she never left any description of her personal visit to Korea. And the most important for the knowledge of Korea of the pre-war Czechoslovakia was the translation of The Grass Roof by Heung-su. The Grass Roof was published by a leading Czech publishing house, translated by the top publisher, the top translator from English, and it had not less than 4 editions before the World War II, an addition of 3 editions later on. And it became a must-to-read for virtually every intelligent Czech in those times. This was the first time when Korea really became the part of the knowledge of the Czechs. And also there were a couple of travelers. The leading Czech geographer Danesh, who was also Consul General of Czechoslovakia in Sydney, traveled through Korea and left a nice chapter published, which was published also in Transactions in English translation. And more interesting is the travelogue of a man named Bohemia. We don't know much about him, we only know that he traveled the world. He was in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Fiji, Papua New Guinea. He was everywhere, and he wrote many short articles. And his article from Korea is interesting because he was involved in the pro-Korean and anti-Japanese movement. He met with the leading personalities from the press in Korea in the late 20s, and they asked him, why not to give us the presentation about how Czechoslovakia achieved independence? And he really made the presentation, and when the presentation started, Japanese police attacked the place, removed everybody, and he describes. And when everybody was shouting, Manse, Manse, the police was removing me and everybody else. Everybody in Czech Republic was thinking, is it a true story or not? And I must thank the people from Seoul Museum of History who really looked into Tonga Ilbo and found the announcement of his presentation. That means now we know the story is at least 80% true. And these are also the first reflections of Czech among the Koreans. The first is 1925 edition translation of the famous famous drama by Czech named Rossum's Universal Robots, which was published as a third modern contemporary European drama in Korean. And also we know that Czechoslovak films, Czechoslovakia had one of the biggest film production in those years, were presented to Korean public, as we see in the very short report about one of the films from 1932. And otherwise, another person who, on the contrary, showed the Korean culture to Czechs was painter Heung-su. He had at least 2 exhibitions in Prague in 1936, and from the contemporary Czechoslovak press we have this lovely drawing. We don't know where is the original, of course. Lovely drawing of a famous Charles Bridge made by Korean painter. I'm preparing a longer article about his Czechoslovak experiences. But everything important starts in 1943. There is a brand new photo, and I had a presentation about Heung-su last year, but I had not this photo then. This is a photo of one of the first lessons of Korean language made in Prague in 1943, which is extremely early. Even more interesting is that this is part of the film where Heung-su speaks in Korean and gives the lecture of a grammar of Korean, and all this is being done inside Japanese consulate. This is also interesting because he was also teaching Japanese, not only Korean. Here we have what he was doing, and he became the most influential person for early Korean studies in Czechoslovakia. Without him, we would not have the Korean studies nowadays. As you see, he was preparing exhibition, writing on history, translating. It was an extremely hard-working man who at the end lived for 5 years in Prague. This is only the articles we found in Czech, what he wrote while in Prague from 1945 to 1948. His most important book is The Concise History of Korea. It was written in German because he studied in Vienna first and Switzerland, but it was never published in German. It was published in a Czech translation made from German manuscript. Here we have the typical title page of his manuscript. This is the first edition and the second edition made. How the book looks like. As I said, he was an archaeologist and prehistorian. It means older the history is, better the book is. Coming closer and closer to contemporary days, the book became more and more ideological. And as he was a typical left-wing Korean intellectual, the end of the book is not very interesting from today's point of view. But at least you can see the idea how he structured the concise book on history of Korea. Imagine that he was writing it at the end of the World War and the beginning of the first years after. He had no library at hand. Majority of the things had to be written from his memory. From this point of view, it is an extreme achievement. And also he started producing and translating contemporary literature. He was not much interested in literature tradition. And his first most important book is the translation of Daejeon by Kim Nam-chun. This is the very first novel ever published in European language from contemporary Korean literature. There was nothing different. And he did first and the second edition. And it's a translation from Korean into Czech with the help with his first successful student. And he also did an anthology of contemporary Korean literature, which unfortunately remained in the manuscripts, and there are things, many things which will be interesting to read today. There is typical work like Lee Hyosok, Kim Saryang, and many others, but it remained unpublished. In 1948 he left for Pyongyang. He became the head of the Special Commission of the Preservation of Cultural Property, and because he was friend probably of Kim Nam-chun, Park Ho-yeon, it is not surprising that he disappears somewhere around the end of 1952 or early 1953. Without him, the Czech Korean studies will never exist. And now we have at least 4th generation of Korean experts. Thanks to him, the first people learned Korean, and they can start and build on it. And of course, the first books were problematic. Translation of Back to Sun, published during the Korean War. But already in 1968 we have a wonderful anthology of Sicho, which was published and translated from Korean into Czech, and also Kim Il-sung. He was the father. And this is the Czech book published about him with his writing. Also, Czechoslovakia is the place where there is a very early edition of Korean textbook. Here we can see 1949, the first Czech language textbook of Korean, and the second edition. All of this was made thanks to Heung-su, who really made the first efforts to publish something like that, and made by his first successful student. What was going on in 1945 to 15? You can read and I will have it. Czechoslovakia after World War II was understood as a bridge between the East and the West, or at least many people thought about it. But in fact, the years 1945 to 1947 are slow, slippery towards the communist bloc. And when you look on the very intensive contact with the North Koreans, it is one more example. In February 1948, there was a bloody coup when the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia took over the power, and it started 41 years of the communist rule. Immediately when the communist rule started, shortly afterwards, North Korea became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and became also a sort of part of the Eastern Bloc. Now we see the document confirming the establishment of the diplomatic relations between Socialist Czechoslovakia and North Korea, 1948-49, and very soon, in September 1950, Czechoslovakia opened its resident legation in Pyongyang. This is a very rare photo because the legation was opened a few days before the Incheon landing. That means very soon the first diplomat had to run and spend 2 more months later on in Manchurian mountains, and it was not an easy trek, I can imagine. Because the part of the Soviet bloc was very much for helping Korea during the Korean War, there were huge campaigns going on during the times of the Korean War. The most famous one was Hands of Korea, where the most important actors, writers, and everybody in the society was showing the support to North Korea. This is from the National Theatre, and you see very typical symbolic things. Czechoslovakia immediately became a supporter of North Korea as a humanitarian and development country, giving humanitarian and development aid. Very soon we sent the small field hospital, which we see the photo on the left-hand side, was a field hospital where they were treated many people, and you see a typical propaganda photo how the Czechoslovak medical doctors together with the Koreans are helping the population. Also, soon after the war, Czechoslovakia built a huge hospital in the city of Chongqing. You see it here still with a memorial plaque saying how Czechoslovakia helped, which was removed after the Sino-Soviet split in the early 1960s. And here also nice photo of all the staff of the hospital in the best times. Czechoslovakia also received something like 1,000 Korean orphans, which were living in a couple of dorms around Czechoslovakia, and they were also seen and shown as a typical propaganda tool. They were receiving the Christmas gifts. The Minister of Defense, then number 2 ranking person in the communist system, was coming to visit them. There are the films and books about them. And also translations. Chokichon back to Sun, but also the original Czech book, showing the poems and short stories in favor of North Korea against American imperialism. Maybe you will be surprised that even such a famous writer like Milan Kundera wrote at least 2 short poems about North Korea. And I'm pretty sure he will never allow them to be reprinted nowadays. But thanks that we have a library, so we can. Virtually everybody of the famous writers and artists did something to support the North, either willingly or not so willingly, frankly saying. And also plenty of propaganda booklets, which the interest is only the very colorful and crazy colors, as you can see. This is a Chinese volunteers. The other one is named Truth About Korea. You can imagine what is in. As I said, the only interesting part is the colors. But because Czechoslovakia was an important film country, it also came with an idea that it must do and it must prepare really kind of a communist blockbuster movie. And it was the idea of creating a movie where many nationalities will be shown on a great youth festival in Prague. It was a full-color, white-side musical where everybody was there. And we also had a Korean, of course. Famous dancer Czech has visited Prague on numerous occasions, and she brought her daughter, and she became one of the actresses also giving and showing Korean dance in that famous film of 1952. More about the films you can find on the table. And the most important part on the moment comes when Czechoslovakia is asked to be the neutral nations supervisory commission member. Here you can see the first 300 soldiers and officers leaving from the heart of Prague to the main train station, which was 500 meters from there, bounding to the train and going to Kassel. They became part of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission. Here you can see them already in DMZ, where they were preparing the repatriation of prisoners of war on both sides. These are the original Czech photos from collections of those men who are now usually between their 80s and 90s, who were serving in Pyongyang in those times. This is one of them, then young officer, later on one of the most important communist diplomats, twice first deputy minister of foreign affairs and ambassador to London and Paris. This is how the camp looked like in Pyongyang on the very beginning. But they found soon that there is a winter in Korea which they haven't suspected. They had to build more permanent houses. And they were traveling across the whole country to the north. And there is a beautiful photo of a Czechoslovak Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission camp in Mantou in the North Korea. This is how the work looked like, and I will slowly go through the photos. Counting the soldiers, looking on the war remains, counting the tanks, leaving and entering the country. And also traveling, there were attacks. There was two attacks on their lives in southern part of Korea, and you see off-limit area, which was difficult. For them, it was also not easy. We have published a book of the photos. And there is a series of photos you can imagine how the Czechs looked like, how the Czechs saw Korea in those times. I will go only through the photos. This is daily life in DMZ, Bridge of No Return, 1954. And this is the line. This is the demarcation line saved by a North Korean soldier. This is Kaesong 1953, when the Kaesong Namdaemun was still destroyed. This is 1955, when it was already partly repaired. Also the famous sights from Kaesong. This is a fairly funny photo, where the North Korean soldier and Czechoslovak soldier are not nicely behaving. And this is how they saw daily life in Kaesong. What is the most important on these photos is the fact that there was a tradition of photographing in Czechoslovakia before the war. And that's why when they were going to such a place like Korea, many of the soldiers took their cameras with them. And because they were neutrals, they could cross the side to the south, where they could buy easily Kodachrome films, and they could develop the films very well. While, because they were neutrals on the north side, they could freely photograph in the north with no obstacles. That means we have a wonderful documentation on a good quality films, and you see how 60 years later the photographs are beautiful. Once more, the typical views on the Czech photographs, how they saw Kaesong, And all these photographs were made not later than 1956. Overview of Pyongyang. Main street in Pyongyang, 54-55. Manpo, Yellow River. I personally love this photo. I can imagine how difficult it was to do such a photo with that quality of cameras. Once more, I will still with you. The totally destroyed Chongqing in 1954. Still traditions being observed, destroyed church, everything destroyed. But still various things typical for Korea remained in the 1950s. I very much like this photograph, which combines the traditional Korea and newly established communist regime in the north, using the flags in the same moment, using the traditions, and remains of the Buddhist temples, which were still operational then. And this was farewell to them. This is one of the men, 90 years old, who was then photographing, and I asked him, was it difficult to photograph in North Korea? He said, no, we were friends, I could do whatever I can. Okay, he was the head of the counterintelligence unit, he could. And in the same moment, the Korean studies were appearing. There's a Sijia translation, and in the middle, the man who translated it was the first North Korean who learned perfectly Czech Nam-Kidok. He returned back to Korea, he translated 2 Czech books, and, as usual, disappeared without trace overnight, and nobody ever heard from him since the early 1960s. In the same moment, the Korean experts in Czechoslovakia understood that doing something with North Korea is fairly difficult. That means they focused themselves on traditional studies of classic. One of the important books is Ancient Art of Korea, made by Jaroslav Bařinka, the man who is here, who is still alive, and Werner Forman, who was a leading Czech photographer of Asian art. Since the 1960s, our relations with Korea were nothing than cordial, technically. And one of the signs were that North Korean films had a quota and they had to be shown in Czechoslovak cinemas. Frankly, majority of the 50 films which were shown in Czech cinemas never had bigger audience than 1,000 people. We can imagine why. The only successful North Korean film in Czech cinema is Heung-su, made in 1980s. The reason is very easy. In communist Czechoslovakia, the kung fu films with Bruce Lee were forbidden. And the young boys wanted to see the martial arts movies. Thus, Heung-su from North Korea was the only substitute. This is the only North Korean film which had an audience higher than 30,000. Still nothing. And as I say, our relations of communist Czechoslovakia with the North were nothing else than protocolar. We see Kim Il-sung visiting Prague, and in the same moment, the Communist Party had visiting Pyongyang in the 1980s. And we can see how Rodon Shinmun was covering the friendly visits from communist Czechoslovakia. Nothing really important. But in the same moment, we started having contacts with South Korea. This is the first photo direct I found, which is the first soccer match on the Tokyo Olympics where Czechoslovaks crushed South Korea heavily. Everything was starting changing before the Olympic Games and everything, and Czechoslovakia was not, of course, boycotting the Seoul Olympic Games. We won the 3 gold medals, and it became the beginning of the deals with the South. The most important date in modern Czechoslovak history, or Czech Republic history, is 17 November 1989, when the fall of the communist regime started. The very same day, Deputy Minister of Foreign Trade of Communist Czechoslovakia was sitting in Seoul and signing the declaration of opening the trade offices between the countries. Before he came back, he was out-seated and he was not a deputy minister, and very soon the diplomatic relations with South Korea were signed in the beginning of 1990 when the communist regime fell. Soon afterwards, President Havel has visited Korea. That's the only bad photo I have found. And in the same moment, the Czech studies in the late 80s, early 90s were created on Heung-su University of Foreign Studies. Here are the first generation of students, now a young student head of the department today. And that was the beginning of intensive contacts between Czechs and Koreans. Some of the successes of Korean experts on Czech, translation of Kundera, translation of Hrabal, another famous Czech writer, book about the history of Czech literature. In 1993, we took part in Daejeon Expo, which was the first big show of the Czech culture and industry in Korea. And of course, presidents and prime ministers met on various occasions. Now, then the Prime Minister of Czech Republic, now the President, on the visit with Kim Dae-jung. And in the same moment, some of the successes of Czech Korean experts. Nowadays, 160 Korean books were translated into Czech. Of these, approximately 70 directly from Korean. And probably the most important is the complete translation of Samguk Yusa, which took 5 years, which was finished last year. And also we started a series of contemporary and modern literature. The first volumes were published in last year. Once more, various presidential and prime ministers' visits, and now how our brand is in Korea. What helped was the Lovers in Prague series. After this, a number of Korean tourists doubled from 30,000 to 60,000, and Prague really became a romantic city. We are very pleased of it, thanks to Pyongyang. But we have 10 different Czech musicals on Korean stages. Virtually nobody knows that famous Jackie the Ripper, which is now as a K musical winning in Japan, is in fact Czech musical, not Korean. But we don't care. It's important we do have it. Also, Czech films could be seen on the festivals widely, including Busan, Bucheon, and elsewhere. We had a big festival of Czech culture in 2011 where 25 different events were taking part in October. Days of Prague in Seoul and otherwise were quite an important event. And last year we opened Czech Cultural Center in Hongdae. We also opened the Czech Tourism Office. We can see a Czech theater, 2011 last year. Big exhibitions which are also following next year, a couple of them. Also, you can hear biggest Czech ensembles. In 2 weeks' time, we will have the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra in Seoul. Translations of Czech books are more and more visible. And what Korea means for us. Third biggest trade partner outside Europe. Fourth biggest investor. Third source of incoming tourists. Imagine that last year 150,000 Koreans visited Prague, and this year in the first quarter we have increased of 43%. That means probably this year 200,000 people will visit Czech Republic. And biggest investments, Hyundai Motor, Korean Air taking over part with Czech Airlines. These are the things which really makes our relations, which started on Kangwa Island, not very successfully great. And because every ambassador should do a promotion for their trade, please drink more Czech beer. Thank you.
So, Ambassador Olchak can entertain a few questions on the floor. So, please.
I think I can speak loud enough. A while ago, I thought I heard you mention that not only was the first European to die in Korea from Czechoslovakia, but also Czechs were responsible for the plane crash in Korea. Did you ever find out more about that? Okay. Whoa. Yeah, you mentioned a couple months ago that the very first plane crash in Korea was a Czech airplane. Did you ever find out more about that?
Yes, there was Czechoslovakia, Hello, love. Czechoslovakia during the pre-war period was a big producer of aircraft, especially for the army use, and they were flying all over the world. And one of the test flights got one of these aircraft from Prague flying to Tokyo. It was a fairly unfortunate flight because the aircraft crashed close to Heung-su first. They succeeded to repair it. It almost crashed next to Daegu for the second time. After they got to Japan, returned back through Korea, and finally totally crashed on Siberian territory. That means it was not a great thing. I am pretty sure, we do have some documents about that crash in Heung-su, but I'm pretty sure that such thing could not be unnoticed by the Korean press, and that's maybe somebody to find. And I'm pretty sure this might be probably the first air crash on Korean territory.
Could you talk a little bit more about the Czech involvement in the North Korean War, for example? How many Czech soldiers were involved in the North Korean conflict?
None. We were truly neutral from the point of view of war. The only people who were there were experts on a development cooperation, especially in the last moments of the war, and we had that hospital, field hospital helping. The only support for North Korea, saying it very simply, there were no arms delivered, nothing. The only thing which we delivered were the coats. You saw it on one of the photos, there was a really long black coat, which was in fact the Wehrmacht coats, and you can't use these very high quality Wehrmacht things in post-war Europe. That means this was given, and the same was some of the German boots were used by the North Korean army.
So what was the number of Czechs involved in that particular mission or enterprise?
I do have the list. It was, if we speak during the war, it was a couple of tens. After the war, we speak about hundreds.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for a presentation. I have so many questions, but I will just ask one. You said that the Czechoslovakian embassy was opened in Pyongyang in September 1950. This is obviously during the Korean War, and it was just a little bit later in November that Pyongyang was taken by the Korean and United Nations forces. So my question is there an account by any of the Czech diplomats who were in the embassy at the time about what it was like when they arrived in September and very quickly had to leave or were captured? I don't know what happened to them in November.
First, one small note, the fact that the embassy was opened during the war doesn't mean it was planned like that. It was planned to be opened before the war, but with no aircraft, nothing, the diplomats were moving by trains. That means it was planned and it happened that it was opened in September. We do have the accounts, how it was. I love one of the accounts when the head of our mission is sending a cable to Prague from Manchurian Mountains saying, I am very sorry, I can't tell you more, but you should understand we are a big cut of information here. Yes, they were cut off information, fairly much, and they were really trekking for 2.5 months in the mountains, crossing the border to China and returning back, having no idea what's going on. That means there are the reports, but there are reports about starvation, hunger, no information, coldness. These are the reports.
Okay.
Can I just shout? I was curious about Heung-su. He said he was working in Prague in 1943. So presumably he was there with the approval of the Nazi occupation government. What was the relationship between the Nazis and Korea, given that he was a man of left-wing sympathies?
Very basically, he studied first in Japan, secondly in 36 he went to Vienna, 38 he moved to Switzerland, and of course he was a Japanese passport holder. That means during the war, in effect, he was from the friendly country. That means This was a very positive thing for him. The fact that he was teaching Japanese probably allowed him also to teach Korean. Probably they will not allow him to teach only Korean. But he was teaching both Japanese and Korean. And he was with very friendly relations with Japanese, because he was even preparing a special exhibition of Japanese modern art for occupying German authorities in Prague. Logical, he couldn't be. But the very day the war ended, he showed very clearly that he is not a pro-Japanese, he is not pro-Nazi, he was a left-wing intellectual who hided it very, very well.
I was wondering, how accurate was Ludwig Merrill's engravings?
They were accurate as any other European painter could be accurate. There is a lovely painting of a Pyongyang on a swing, European swing, of course. He had no idea about Korea. It's a combination of Orientalism, Japanese style, Chinese style, mixture of anything which is not European. He had no idea.
So then we can assume that he did not meet Hong Jong-yu.
No, of course. He knew nothing about Korea. He landed a job. He wanted to make money, and he made illustrations. That's all. That's a coincidental situation.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Heung-su.